Hello and good morning. This is Conrad Carding, and I'm joined here again by my good friend John Butler. Good morning, John.
Morning, Conrad. Morning, everyone.
So the goal is today to talk about publishing, and we're here to answer all your questions about publishing. And John had that idea that we should talk about how long it takes. John, let's talk about how long it takes to publish a paper. Um, I get these numbers from you, like 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year. Um, but but like, how can it take so long?
Well, it can take longer. I have a paper now on my desk that I have to read. That's 12 years in the gestation and finishing.
12
So
years. That is
12
not bad.
years. I have longer as well. But uh, I would say it varies. There's this thing is when does this project start is one question. If you're an experimentalist, like the project probably starts before you, like at the very beginning, where you start thinking about what I'm going to ask, what am I going to do, and then collecting the data. And data collection can take ages. So even if you're like, people complain, and I have studies that people maybe should complain about with low N, but even collecting, for example, 10, 20 people, if you're by yourself, that's minimum of 40 days, minimum, if you're collecting that data. And so that could just be behavioral or EEG. So straight off, to collect a very small data set that now people don't really want to publish, or people are more inclined to look at with suspicion, you're talking 22 to 3 months just collecting data. That's not data analysis. And that's working every day. That's alone. For me, I can say on my side, the longest part is the writing. And I think that's true for everyone. But the data analysis, even with simple behavioral data, there's a lot of back and forth. So big or small data sets, it can be a lot of back and forth because, you do want to explore your data thoroughly, but you also have your hypothesis as well. So it can be very difficult for that. So already I'm talking up to 6 months. And this is something running without something breaking. 6 months before you start really putting the paper together. And then, I don't know, writing a paper, and this is something everyone should know. A first draft is the first draft. I found this very hard early on, is don't worry if your first draft is awful. If you have a good collaborator or a supportive
Yeah,
supervisor, that's a big thing to hand a
but
bad draft.
the first draft, like what the way I call that is vomit draft, and I know a lot
Yeah,
of people who call it like that. It's just psychologically so helpful to just say, I will now make all this text, and then because editing is just psychologically so much
so
easier than
much easier.
reading, no?
Editing is so much easier. Uh, and if you have a supervisor who will put a lot of red on your document, but put red in the right way. That's the big thing is, even now, when I send a paper to someone, I expect to see red on it. If I've written the paper fully all by myself and it's perfect, then what the hell am I have collaborators for? Part of it is you need their input. And if something's too perfect, it's very hard sometimes to edit a document that's perfect as well. Definitely as a co-author, if someone says, "Oh, this has been perfectly polished," like it's very hard to intervene then because the person has too much, a paper becomes a baby. And that can be 6 months. So the quickest I can think of is a year to get to submission. And then we get to the review process. Actually, I'm going to ask you, how long is the longest review process you've had?
Okay, so the longest review processes are usually kind of the student or postdoc who's handling it has long moved on and kind of, but is a perfectionist. So it kind of takes a long time for them to get every iteration. So like But it takes them half a year to turn around, and then it takes the journal half a year to turn around, and it can go for 3 years or something, the
Yeah,
process.
it really can. And once again, I've had all experiences. I've been fortunate and I've been very unfortunate. I've had one where, and it was a particularly difficult one for me. It was my first paper in neuroscience, and I had it in a journal. Had 3 reviewers. Now it wasn't very well written, and I look back and think, yeah, they're right to complain a bit about it. But one reviewer, just wasn't going to let it go, and it was a year in review and got rejected.
Yeah, those things do happen.
But then I did something, and I'm so grateful that I did it now. I invited someone else to come in as a collaborator. My main collaborator throughout my many years is Jennifer Campos. She came in from the psychology side. I came in, I knew my data was good. I knew my analysis was good. I knew my thinking was good. I wasn't able to verbalize it. She came in, that paper, then she helped me rework it. And between the two of us, we write together quite a bit now, and it's a wonderful process. But it's without any false modesty, that paper is by far my most cited paper, like 300 sites, 300 plus sites. But
nice.
It was a difficult process. Journal of Vision, but it was a difficult process. It shouldn't be, but it can be.
So I want to put a pen a little bit into the writing process. So my first paper took me like 2 years of writing, and it was the most painful thing you can imagine. But then later in my career, and I joined Daniel Walbert, who's a bit of a genius as a writer. He just moved to Cambridge University. He was at to Columbia University. He was at UCL London at that previous time. And there I felt like for the first time, I really saw a process for writing. And so I want to briefly talk about that process of writing. I don't know what your process is, but here's how my process works. I kind of, before doing any experiments, and maybe you'll find that weird or shocking, before doing any experiments, I ask every student and myself, if I'm doing a solo paper, to write the abstract. At that point of time, of course, you don't know what the results will be, but it's great for multiple reasons. So the first one is as like a sanity check. You can say, if I write the abstract and I'm like, yeah, that actually sounds really quite interesting. It's kind of like a much stronger evidence for it being interesting than hey, let's fuss around with this with this setup here. So that's the first one, is a first level of checking if the idea is interesting. The second one is, it's difficult if a paper has too complicated a narrative structure. There's often extra experiments and stuff, and it kind of goes all through, and it's hard to understand for the reader and hard to understand for the writer and hard to write and so forth. So usually, I generally think that a paper should only have one idea. That writing the abstract first kind of forces you to put the idea on paper. Now, of course, once the data comes in, everything can change, but it's a very good test at that point of time.
No, I don't do as much as I should, but on the other hand, when you write a grant, you kind of have written a fake abstract on some level. But I completely agree. And actually, I know it does sound weird, but if you have a paper with 2 messages, it's very hard for people to read it on some level. One of the messages gets lost, which seems daft. Everyone who reads these papers are considered experts, well-versed readers, but also they're reading 100 papers at the same time. So sometimes a paper should have a clean, strong thing. Secondary statements that are supplementary might be, but 2 messages I think, confuse the message of the paper. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like finding a structure to that and working with someone, like for myself, my postdoctoral supervisor, John Fox, his first degree was English. So he took great pride in writing. And a paper I wrote with him, I was really proud of. I had to write, it was going to a journal that only had a 500-word introduction. And I wrote it, and I wrote the whole paper, and it was fine. And he said that was the most boring introduction he's ever read, because it was, he put it straight. That he said, John, you've just written a list about the methods and not about the story. And sometimes that's hard as well with that writing process, is the balance between being a cold scientist, but also that there is a narrative aspect to anything you write, because you need the reader to come along with you with the story, with the narrative of a paper. And that's hard as well. Like, it's not something that's intuitive. It's something you have to work on. And that's what I learned from definitely John, is he was someone I thought was a fabulous writer, but he still rewrote and rewrote and rewrote. And he wanted us to think initially, to put down an abstract early on, like what you say, to say what the goal of this study is, to really think about it before you kick into it. You know?
But I mean, like, in the end, narrative doesn't feel so complicated. That might just be because I'm old, but here's the universal structure of good narratives. No, like, it's, hey, look, John, if we look at science, there's this thing that is important that we don't know anything about. And you'll be like, yeah, that would be cool if we knew something about it. So that's kind of the beginning. And then, like, stuff happens, results, methods, all that. And then it wraps up and it's like, okay, here's the answer for that thing. And then kind of the end. No, like, it's like every Disney story is of the exact same format. No, like, we get to know the hero has a prom. And then stuff happens. And then the prom is solved, and kind of with an allusion to happy ever after.
But even, I'm going to say from my ignorant side, is I didn't think of papers in that fashion. I thought papers should be dull, but like the paper you've written and all this, and even now as I get older, like the advice to write the abstract early on, that the abstract and the paper are the same thing. It's just what was a sentence in the abstract now becomes a section, almost like a couple of paragraphs. But like, it's that telescoping out, but having that simple structure, which is so obvious when you see it. But if you think that you need to be an independent writer without structure, you're causing yourself a lot of stress that you don't need. But like, I actually to make you to embarrass you, like, I always give my undergraduate students your paper. The first thing I do is, when I'm doing even an undergraduate part, because they go, how do I structure an abstract? And you're going, how do I structure a paper? How do I structure? It has a formula. Don't overthink the formula.
I mean, to be clear, like all formula, there are ways of breaking them in a.
There are ways of breaking them, but if you have the formula, you can break it. But if you don't have the formula, you can't break it.
Exactly, it's just random stuff. If you don't understand the formula, by all means, like, if it's like, okay, here's the prom, you can creatively break it. And like, when I was 17, my mom took me shopping and then from there you kind of get to the same place, kind of the opposite direction or something. That is genius, but you can't develop.
You can't have that. Yeah, you can't have that fun until you have the structure. It's something I thought when I was a younger writer and a younger scientist, and a younger lecturer as well when I was teaching. I thought fun was what would carry it through. But now, as I get older, and it sounds a bit more boring, the structure is how you have the fun. Rules are how you have fun. But like, it's that rule is then you can do a fun sentence. And I was talking with one of the, as a mentor, I was talking to one of the Neuromatch groups about their abstract. And they had a nicely written abstract. It was really perfect. But it's that we talked early on is, what's the big picture? Tell me why you do this. don't initially tell me about your analysis. Tell me why it's important. Then narrow your way in. These
But
little extra make a huge difference to readability.
and I think it's important for the NeoMatch students to kind of know how universally these things are not known. So if I
Oh yeah.
run something for the UPenn students, these are like Ivy League trained, like highly selected university, all that. The vast majority of abstracts that they write in the first round don't tell you why you should care. It's
Yeah, and I don't know what it's like for you, Conrad, but like in Ireland, and definitely for me, people who were good at science were less encouraged maybe to be good at writing. So then it was actually only in my master's, I didn't even have to do a final year's project. My first thing I ever wrote was my master's. And that was a very daunting, like, of course, it's much more daunting if it's not your first language. But even in your first language, if you're not a confident writer, if you have been told you're very good at science, there is an implicit thing that maybe you're not a good writer, or it's not your strong point. And it might not be. But like science, like everything, you can learn. And it's that thing, is it's willingness to learn it. But yeah, I definitely see it. I see it, like, I'm amazed. But I think back, I was an idiot when I was a PhD student, but like, as in I was unaware. But I'm amazed.
same here in
Yeah,
so many ways.
I am amazed that like people are surprised when I go, no, it's a simple formula. It's actually like when I teach statistics and I teach my first hypothesis test, I say this is the same how I write an abstract. Your null hypothesis is what everyone thinks is going to happen. Your alternative is what you believe will happen, which is always a funny thing in science, because anyway, the test is your methods. The analysis is the analysis, and then the conclusion is the conclusion. Like those 5 steps of, it's the same 5 steps, and you narrow it down to 300 words for an abstract or 200 words, and you expand it out to 2,000 plus words for a paper. But that structure is what the thing. And the other thing about writing is, if you write short sentences initially, you can make them longer afterwards. But if you write long sentences with many points within it, it's very hard to break it down after. It was a bit of advice, once again, from John Fox's. If you're always writing short sentences, you know your structure is going to be straightforward enough. But if you want the reader to get something different, they might need, every once in a while you can add a longer sentence and the reader will notice something changes. But you can only do that from having simple flow early on. And so don't try to write like your favorite author initially. Have a sentence in there that you'll love.
And
the rest of the time,
And simplicity is just so valuable. No, we are writing for a worldwide audience. I mean, NeoMatch, like, look at who we are, like all the countries, all the people, using really complicated words and sentences. That we're not trying to prove to people that we're clever. We're trying to be useful in our writing for them. And in that sense, I want to encourage people for simplicity. And I think this is a big misunderstanding that a lot of people, including like a lot of supervisors, believe that kind of there is value itself in making things sound complicated. No, it's if you get what my paper is about, and because it's so simple, it just takes you 5 minutes to read, everyone wins. There's no downside.
Yeah, no, but I do think sometimes it can come from an insecurity as well. Is that if I make it so complicated, then people will think I'm smart, so they'll be less inclined to attack this. Sometimes people believe that if you can explain something efficiently and simply, it's not complicated.
In reality, that simple explanation might require a lifetime of work to get there. But not how people think.
And you and I talked about this, but like when I've written articles for children, they're the hardest ones to write initially, because I have to change my language. I have to, because of the environment I'm in, because of all these, a lot of people interact with have university level degrees, like, and so forth, even PhDs. So I use a language that isn't common, and that's a bad thing, because a lot of the words I can use can be simplified, and it does not downgrade the meaning. It does not downgrade the depth of the thinking. And I think early on, maybe I thought a bit like that. And coming from mathematics, so when I wrote my first 4 mathematics papers, and all I wrote was, they were more or less, this is the amazing thing. So now we can talk about plagiarism. I self-plagiarized more or less my 4 first papers, because I was just doing more or less the same equation. And my supervisor said, why would you change that? We've written it. You know, you changed part of the equation. That's what's interesting. And you show different results. But like, the introduction can be very similar to what you had before. And then when I moved into neuroscience, everyone go, oh, don't self-plagiarize. You can't even self-plagiarize your method. And you're going, well, it's a very similar, you know, like, but different fields have different ways of writing as well. But, you know, simple is best. If you worry that something sounds too simple, you've won. You've done it right. If you've communicated your thing well, like, yeah.
And people use all these things like passive constructions, weird science words, just to try and sound less simple. Like, just no, just don't go down that route.
It is a personal bugbear in the methods section. Is the one section people really avoid the words we. And in the methods and results, in methods and analysis section is the part where I do the most decision making. We chose to do this experiment, not this experiment was done. We chose to involve, I chose to do this analysis, not the other analysis. Could have been as good, but I chose it. And that passive voice takes away the choice element, that you're going, oh, science is an eternal thing that chooses it for me. No, I chose it because that's what I learned earlier on, or I liked it, or
That's
you
right.
know, yeah. So that also a thing, but it is science writing.
So John, I wanted to go back to process a little bit. So you write the abstract maybe fast if you listen to Conrad. The next stage of writing is outlining, no? Like my experience is that everyone spends too little time outlining, and a lot of people don't even do that.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of the outline. I'm a big fan of sections and subsections. Once again, people don't like subsections, but I love a paper that has clean subsections, because that's your outline. You're showing, I've thought about what I'm presenting here. I've thought about these parts, and it gives it substructure. And as soon as you have that skeleton, you can fill out the flesh much easier, in my mind. But
yeah, so the way the outlining stage works for me is kind of everything that in the end will be a paragraph is exactly one sentence, namely the sentence that the reader takes away from it. Now, what that means is that any idea that doesn't make it into my outline doesn't belong into the paper. Every idea that the paper needs to have a line in my outline. If it doesn't, so basically the way it works is if I go to that outline stage, I do the outline, I'm like, okay, do I say all the things I need to say? Are there any of these things that I don't need to say? There could be like ideas that are perfectly clever, but if that idea doesn't like really fit into the narrative of the paper, it better die. And so kind of the outlining should be slow. Like, no one wastes their time by spending a week even on outlining.
no.
Show me the people who spend more than 2 hours outlining.
I think 2 hours even is that, but like, because the opposite is what happens is people spend a week on a paragraph, and then it turns out that paragraph's going to disappear because you realize it isn't relevant. And so, I like to go back and forth, get the skeletal form of it. I don't know if I go as far as paragraph specific, but definitely like section specific enough that I know that here should be coming in. But yeah, no, it's such a big thing. What people worry about is, oh, my sentence should be perfect, as opposed to the meaning of this paragraph? And it's that real tension that every early writer or every early person, I need this to sound perfect. I have the perfect sentence here going. A paper is going to be reviewed, like internally reviewed before it gets even submitted to a journal, back and forth, let's say 10 times. It's going to lose a sentence or two along the way. You're going to, if you have a love of a sentence, your heart is going to be broken. So it's that the love of what the paragraph is telling you is what matters.
So I mean, like, I might be an outlier there, but I pushed very hard on kind of following the structure there. And for me, writing now is really, it's very, very fast. So for me, it's more like a paper is a week of writing, maybe. And the way it works is the following. I write the abstract and I obsess about the abstract. I go and like every sentence gets changed like 10 times and I read it with others and I send it to my friends and kind of like I do stuff with the abstracts. And then I do the outline and I really like obsess about the outline. Like, for example, what people when I edit someone else's papers, I almost always find the whole idea, the same idea, in multiple paragraphs.
Yep.
I also find that lots of paragraphs contain multiple ideas, like all the time, and that's because they happen by agglomeration of sentences. So whereas I feel now that and of course, like I know it's like I've been doing it hundreds of times, like basically I'm an overtrained writer. That's the one thing that like I spend my life on. But the way it now feels is like I write that out, that abstract, and then I write the outline, every single thing, and then I force myself to just follow the process. So every line becomes exactly one paragraph. Like I don't have any freedom while I write the so-called vomit draft. No, it's like every line now this has got to be 6 lines. Okay. I hate that. Let me have some more coffee. But basically everything I kind of give myself at most like 5 minutes or so to make a first version of the abstract, which sounds like awfully long until you think about the fact that the paper might only have like 20, 30 paragraphs. So if every 20 paragraphs takes 5 minutes, like the whole paper is written in a few hours. So
there's a thing, if you, I definitely don't write as fast as you, but if you write 500 words a day and you're happy with the 500 words, which doesn't sound like a lot, but 500 words a day that are good, you would be the most published person in the world, because 500 words is a lot if you're happy with it. Actually, I have a question for you about that. Do you keep that sentence that describes what this paragraph be constantly in the paper until the very end, or is it like a comment, or how do you maintain that purity of the paragraph?
So they become, for me, I italicize them and they kind of
exactly
become a title for the thing, and then I take it out once everything's finished. It kind of lives there as like italicized little things just to remind me what the paragraph is about.
Well, I have to say, even if no one else gets anything from it, that's a huge thing I'm going to be pushing, because I'm writing a paper now. So I'm definitely going to try that and leave that sentence in from the thing. Because actually, I have to say, one reason is definitely with younger authors and the kind of population that we have here, who are people who are very good at analysis. You want to show how much analysis you do. So sometimes it's very hard to give up an analysis in a paper. And that's something that you learn with time, is you can do all this analysis. It's great. But if none of it actually supports, if it all just repeats the initial simple analysis, then you've learned how to do an analysis and leave it to the side. And that's something I had great difficulty in early on. Is
the paper should only have the analyses that are needed to fill the gap that the paper is about. And it's very hard. No, like every analysis, there's like a sense of creativity that goes into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it feels very painful to cut it out. But you've got to cut it. Like,
I know it. And as a young, like when I was starting this, and I was so proud, like I developed different methods. I probably should have written some papers about some of the methods back in the day, but I want to show them in the paper, and I was running towards that. I wanted to show so much about, oh, how, like this might not be well written, but the analysis are thorough. But none of it was helpful because the t-test solved the thing. Sometimes it is heartbreaking that in the end, and like a linear regression gives you the same answer. You know, you could like you don't have to do the hardest thing every time. You can look.
I mean, like, look, if it's a stats paper, that's fine to establish a new method. It's just that kind of every innovation, it feels it's almost impossible to get rid of it once you have it, and that makes cutting things difficult.
But then, like, if you're a PhD student, that's what goes into your PhD. It's, you know, it shows you've learned something, but does not have to go into the paper of that chapter. And still, I definitely still struggle with that. Actually, right now, I'm struggling with it. I've done 7 different simulations. They're all very interesting, but really they all say the same thing. And it's which illustrates this the strongest and most consistent and tells the reader what they should know is what you ask yourself on everything. You know, because this is something with my first paper, I had great ownership. I took it very personally. And now as I got older, I tried to separate myself from the papers. But do remember, your paper isn't you. Your paper isn't the thing. So it's okay that it isn't exactly perfect or how you want it. It's that I do find a lot of the stress students and we give ourselves is that we believe the paper is a representation of ourselves. No, it's a facet. It's a single facet upon myself. And maybe I definitely, not maybe, I was someone who did a lot of fast science at certain points because I believed that the more papers I had, the more it mattered for my getting tenure. And in the end, probably 10 of my papers are the ones that matter for tenure. And so there is that balance and that fight.
So, you know? But to be fair, like, writing a good number of papers is probably both a good exercise for ourselves.
Yes.
And it does help us get tenure. So
it does. But I wonder, is there a difference between 50 and 100? Like if you say, you know, well, 100 maybe, but 50 and 60 and 50 and 80 and, you know, yeah.
It's in generally, I think, things are exponentially distributed. You know? Like, so people are always, oh, but I could do a little more. But most people will then be like at tenure time factor 3 above the threshold or factor 3 below the threshold. And I think the same thing is for all things. You know? Like there are people, I don't need to see 10 papers to hire someone as a PhD student. The difference between 1 and 10 feels relatively small because as soon as you publish papers, you show that you care about it. But the difference between 0 and 1 is very big in a way. And that goes in a lot of different ways.
Also, if you're in an engineering field, the IEEE conference papers are lovely papers to start with. They have a strict deadline. They're 4 pages or 8 if you want to pay more. And they're a great place to start. I have not too many of them, but it was great working as a student, PhD student, postdoc, getting 1 or 2 of them. It gave me confidence as well. Like you shouldn't always, and this is something I think we will talk about, you shouldn't always be looking for journal papers. And more and more people are less and less looking for them, thankfully. But like a conference abstract that's 2 pages, it's not a paper, but it shows you have something down. And that's the big thing. That's what every supervisor wants to see in the end is not the best product, but that you actually finish something enough that it can go out into the world. It might not be perfect, but that's a huge thing to see in my mind. And even an abstract, when you're so like if you are an undergraduate student and you get the opportunity to do an undergraduate conference, even in your own university, do it.
100% good.
It is like I keep on asking my students to do it, but it's a thing, and I'm part of this because even that shows that you get some process. Like that's kicking into the process is so important early on, in my mind.
So I want us to switch to answering some questions. So here I have a question by Ranjith Jagannathan, who asks, I have two questions. One, how do you personally prioritize long-term fundamental research versus research that leads to quick publications to meet career expectations? I will get to the second question next.
Yeah, it's actually funny. I've not been strategic in my thing. What happens is, to me, it's random a bit. It's just whichever one kind of bubbled up at that time was the one I went for. I am a very social scientist, so it's actually normally with collaborators. When I have collaborations, I don't name the folder like multi-sensory or something like that. I name it after the person I'm working with. So actually, it sometimes can be in this. You might have less ownership. What can happen is for myself, and this is something I try to get better and better at. Sometimes by working with other people, I ignore my own work, and you have to be careful about that. That's my only bit of advice is that people. But it should be neither should matter. It should be the one that entertains you or you enjoy the most at that moment. And sometimes it's nice to go back and forth.
But I think we can add a little more nuance there. Like if you're an undergraduate and you really want to do a PhD and you get the chance to either work on something very long-term or something that will be out before you are applying to positions.
Oh, then do the short thing.
Yeah, there's a very good point. It's also, I would even go further to say, very early on in your career, doing like some papers just so that you get the process down is actually quite good, because like the only way to understand and learn the process is kind of go through the process. So it's almost like I'd recommend to people to write a paper to get it out of your system on how the paper writing and paper making works.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like even going through what the review process was, knowing that you have to format it in a certain way, like it's shocking to learn these things. So it actually will come back to like as I say, the IEEE or an internal conference in your own university as an undergraduate is huge. I have started with my PhD students is I make them write a version of a paper for children before they actually write the main paper. So recently I had a PhD student who wrote it on the predator-prey equations, which look a bit like the differential equations that you've seen for excited, but like even that process, it had it through a journal is massive. And that was a short-term goal, but it has a short-term goal that has the massive thing is the review process and the writing process. And it's how we first started writing together with PhD. I write with PhD students. So yeah, when you're young, career. When you're older, yeah.
Well, but let me push into the other direction for the old folks. Now you can say short-term papers are really good for people getting started. Writing lots of shallow papers as a senior person, if you have the opportunity to do deep things, is equally a mistake. And there are plenty of senior famous professors, they shall be remain unnamed here, and all they do is chase like quick and doable nature papers, and like that's how their career looks and feels like, and that is not advancing the field. They are doing what like a very young person arguably should be doing. Like if you're like hungry and you have the chance to get like a high impact paper, like by all means, it's going to make the rest of your scientific life easier. Go for it. But I don't think that senior professors should be chasing it like that anymore.
No, but it is that balance, and that's that. There is a. If I knew how to do a quick Nature paper, I would. But that thing is, it's a balance between, as a supervisor, you want the PhD student to get the quick, but as a supervisor and a researcher, you think long term as well, and so it's that balance between the two. And I
See,
have an overarching long term, but then I have to remember there are chunks I have to. So it's a difficult balance. No.
And in the deep learning field, I'm leading this group called CIFA LMB, and I'm very much trying to push that group towards like the big long-term questions that the field has. Exactly the opposite to what like short-term fame is made out of it.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's important. Let's take Ranjit's second questions. Do you believe that the publish or perish culture impairs the quality and reproducible of research in the deep learning community?
I don't think. Yeah, I don't think the word deep learning has to be stated there. In the community in general, I would say yes, but maybe DL is even worse.
Definitely yes, and deep learning is even more so. No, like the field is moving so fast, but that means that individual papers are often really problematic. Like they're full of proofs that don't apply to the real world. But at the same time, they all contain proofs because proof is considered like a score driving criterion. You get your paper accepted if it contains a proof. If the proof is entirely irrelevant for anything existing on this planet, it doesn't matter. Like the proof is valued there. The code quality is often horrendous. A lot of papers say, oh, we're good because X, and in reality, they're good because of something else, and they never even realized it. So, yes, I mean, like, Ranjit, you're exactly right. No, like, it's absolutely 100% impacting the quality of research and the quality of the average paper. Like, it's a huge problem.
Are DL papers quicker to come out now?
Yeah, yes. So there is this rhythm where in computer science, people will be pushing papers every like 6 months or so at most. And it's expected that when you'll be hired, that you basically have like a whole string of like top conference papers. They don't have long form papers. Basically, 8 pages is the max that they have.
Yeah, like the IEEE. But like, as I say, with the IEEE, you do the short paper and then you expand upon that concept. It's something to get, like, that's, I don't know what it's like for you, but I separate between conference papers and journal papers because they're different writing and different. I have a different expectation for the quality of the data and research, maybe not quality, but it's not quite fully complete. It's a paragraph as opposed to a book. It's chapter instead of a book, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. Cool. Let's take the next question. This is a question by Tuguldur Gerelma, who asks, as an electrical engineering undergraduate student interested in deep learning research, I feel I lack a lot of mathematical background. Should I focus on building a good background before reading research papers? And this is, I think, a general question. Kind of, we all are deficient in areas of what we do as scientists. What are the, should we build the skills first or do the research first?
Yeah, I would say it varies what you mean by reading a paper. There are different levels of reading that we haven't talked about. There are different levels of reading. The first level of reading is the abstract, so you know what the take-home message of the paper was. So you can say, okay, this paper said this. And then there's a bit deeper where you spend a bit of time in the text. And then there's truly deep reading, which can take a week of a mathematical paper or longer, as opposed to a neuroscience paper, which can be a bit quicker. But I would not. I would recommend reading papers to find out which papers you like, because a lot of times with the mathematics, for example, I have found in the applied area of maths, that people write papers with maths in it, and the maths is intentionally confusing. While if you read mathematics papers, they are trying to make it as like it's not, but they're trying to make the reader get through. They're showing you everything. While in neuroscience, and maybe I can't speak for DL, but in neuroscience, when they include maths, they do things that always bug me. Is they say, I integrated this. You go, no, you didn't. You never integrated that differential equation. You use like a numerical method. Don't put an integration sign here, but you don't tell the person. It's like a little asterisk at the end saying we use fourth order Runge-Kutta or something like this. But they make it such that it's hard for you to read the details specific. So that's one thing. So I would not worry about the mathematical background. You're always going to have, you're not going to be good at as perfect at everything, but if you're doing electronic engineering, you'll have enough maths that you should be able to read a lot of the stuff. It's actually getting used to the language of the papers, I would say, would be my thing. Yeah. How would you recommend someone to keep up with it?
And it's easier to motivate yourself to learn things while you're reading papers, I think. So I think I'd go exactly the opposite direction. I'd read, and kind of fill in the aspects of math that we really need. If we are honest, in the vast majority of the deep learning field, the math isn't very deep or very meaningful. There's an awful lot of stuff that we do because it works, and then we add some proof because we're expected to add some proof to it. And those proofs are written by people who aren't even very into writing proofs, and therefore they aren't even very good proofs for the specific problem.
And also, like, well, with a lot of deep learning, because of that, the weird non-linearity of it, you can show a linear solution, but then the non-linear stuff, you go, well, that is experimentally shown and simulation. So like that's the stuff. Also, by reading more than one paper, it could always remember this. It might not be your fault you can't read that paper. It could be that it's just not written the way you like to read it. And by going to a second paper, don't always assume that you're the problem with the reading process. Sometimes just think, okay, this is called a seminal paper, but I can't read this. But I can read this other paper that's not considered seminal, but actually helps me understand more. You know, it's worth knowing by looking at the other things. Now, keeping up the literature, it is hard. Like
for typical proofs, there's plenty of proofs that are of the nature. No, percent correct is always between 0 and 1 or something. And there's ways of thinking about that say, now I have a proof that shows that percent correct can't be minus infinity. It must be between -3 and 7. There's proofs for that. There's a decent amount of that. So I just wanted to surface that.
And keeping up the literature, I on a vein level, I see who's citing my papers, and then I read the papers that cite me, because that's one way of staying maintained in one area. And then I find journals that I like, and I follow those journals. So it's both the researcher and the journals is how I look. But there might be fancier ways.
Yeah, but fancy isn't always good.
Yeah. How do you keep up? Or how do you maintain? Like, also, what becomes a paper? Like, I fell in love with a paper a while back that no one seems to like, but by falling in love with it, it helped me find other papers. One paper helps you find other papers as well. That's a big thing.
Yeah, and they're all linked with one another, and I think it's super useful. I mean, like, just reading is wonderful, and maybe later what I find is rather the people, which papers I read, I get by asking the people whose papers I like to read and looking at what they cite, because there's a network of kind of cool and interesting papers embedded in an infinite-sized network of maybe like slightly less exciting things.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, looking at the references of a paper you liked will get you in the right direction as well. View it like a spider web almost. And there are fancy softwares out there that can show you which paper sites, blah, blah, blah. But it can be very arbitrary. Why I like one paper and someone likes another paper is just I preferred the font.
Yeah.
It's true though. Journal
Well,
vision.
and I think we all have just things that we appreciate. Like when it comes to papers, some people really care a lot about the proof. Some of the people in deep learning really care about state of the art. And it's like you want to be really good at solving technical problems. Others care about like the software engineering. Others care about like the quality of the application domain and so on and so forth. So I think it's legitimate that different people want to consume different kinds of research and insights, and that's good.
Yep. I think we're coming to the end anyway, but the last thing is, maybe it's a bigger question is, do you think the old journal system is coming to an end? Do you think we are evolving slowly to something slightly different than the Elsevier type journal, like eLife now and hopefully Neuromatch?
I don't know. I mean, like we already did change. Like we now have a culture of preprinting. We have a culture of code sharing. Share your code, everyone. We also have a culture of we might be slowly losing the culture of like traditional high prestige journals. We have an emerging culture of platinum open access journals where it's free to submit and free to read. Like, I think all those changes are happening, but then they are happening slowly, and they should be happening slowly because we have a system that's all built on one another. Like publications drive careers, careers drive leadership. Like all these things are connected in really complicated ways. So small changes don't destroy things, and it allows the system to kind of adapt to things. So if you take journal publications off the table, departments will have great trouble knowing like who they should hire. Like that's what we've traditionally used. Is it ideal that we use it? Probably not. But like kind of adding this, like if change gets to be too fast, then it's very hard for the system to adapt.
No, I agree, and there are aspects of the review process and things that are useful, but it is complicated, and I think, like you, Conrad, it shouldn't be an absolute immediate change, but I do think there is progression, and it does make things more open. And like even myself, like I say, writing for children, but like now there are other ways of publishing, maybe not your data, but showing that you're writing. Like in Ireland, the main television, we only have 3 television channels technically. It's radio and television. They now have a section where scientists can write 800 words for them, and they'll publish it, and then it goes online, and you can write what you want within reason. Actually, funny, I offered to write something about deep learning, about just the introduction of the perceptron, and he said, we're bored of AI at the minute. But instead I wrote about the drift diffusion model. So,
So John, I wanted to take one last question, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is a question of Max Hellriegel Holderbaum, who asked, you mentioned that publisher perish is a problem in deep learning. 3 questions. How does deep learning compare to other fields like neuroscience? It's probably worse, and it has a much, much higher pace. And because it's so young as a field, it doesn't have cultural memory. So it like neuroscientists can often think longer and deeper because the field has so much history. How big do you think the reproducibility crisis is as a broader phenomenon in deep learning, e.g. publications bias, problematic methods, and so forth? I'm not 100% sure about it, and we should do an audit on that. There are lots of problems like data leakage in deep learning, like everywhere, that effectively people test, say, the current large language models on prompts that are effectively in the data set. And the definition of in the data set is getting complicated in the deep learning field at the moment. So I think the reproducibility crisis is quite large, and I think we have mostly not found out about it yet. And three, what needs to change? What would young people need to do differently? I mean, in a way, and it might sound weird, I would like the field to slow down. I would like people to take the time to kind of build deeper theories. And that's very difficult because we live in this society in deep learning where you're expected to churn out those papers and come up with that long list by the end of your PhD to get hired. But in reality, a lot of those skills are not the skills that ultimately matter to do impactful research. So I'm slightly worried about like the healthfulness of the deep learning field. I don't know if you have anything to add there, John.
I would say it's. I completely agree with Conrad. I wouldn't blame DL itself. It's the youth of the field. Mathematics doesn't have this because it's been there a long time. It already had preprints. And neuroscience, when it started, people got scared and hid things, and now it's getting preprints. And it's trying to address itself. I would say a lot of what you see in DL is something that would rhyme with what other people have seen in other fields. So it's not that I would completely blame DL. It's just, it's a symptom of a young field that actually also has this increase in thing. Now, is it important? Yes, you have to address it. Is reproducibility important? Yes. Note that reproducibility is not just due to someone being malicious. It can just be, and I think sometimes it's very important to separate the two. Sometimes things can't be reproduced because on that day, it just, you know.
So let me actually briefly still take as a very last question. Farhad Pantaki asks, I have a question that you could answer. Given a paper based on a topic that is interdisciplinary, say psych and mathematics, would the journal of publishing have an impact on the reception of the paper? Like, yes, it absolutely has an impact on the the reception. Is it a good thing? No, people should evaluate it based on what it is. But like, we live in the world where we are, and it doesn't help us if we tell you that it's not. Like, yes, people really care about journals in a way that they shouldn't. And even in ways where it's obvious, like if you have a paper that's 10 years old, or let's say 5 years old, in a not famous journal, but being cited an awful lot. Like, hello, it's just proven that it's better than the good journal. But like, it's still like, this is a +1 paper and this is a Nature paper, and it just changes the way people think about it. And is it the right thing? No. But does it mean that trying to get your papers published in kind of fancier journals is probably helpful for your career? Yes. If you don't depend on that career boost, by all means, kind of ignore the journal. But I'm suddenly not, as a professor, going to tell my students to like not publish in like the glamour journals. And same thing in deep learning, like a NeurIPS paper will help your career to some level. Like there's no denying it. Even if it's the same paper as an triple AI paper or something, the NeurIPS paper will still kind of be more visible.
No, and once again, in America, there's more of a push for that. But like even across fields, even with, there's two levels. Within neuroscience research, people who do monkey research might not read behavioral. Monkey people are a bit better, but behavioral people rarely read monkey research and rarely read mouse and rodent research. And rodent research is rarely, and like even within people who are doing the same kind of thing, that there's sometimes a lack of reading across. And that's why journals exist, and journals kind of reinforce that a bit. It can be hard if you straddle, like computational neuroscientists do, can straddle across, and you can get lost between either and expectations. But once again, with this preprint way and how you find papers has changed a bit. So I think it's lessened, but it's still very you know, it's still quite prominent that the journal kind of dictates the audience. But now, as I say, I look at people as much as I do at journals more and more.